Can we just check the sound there?
Perfect sound.
Right. Okay, fantastic. Good morning, everyone. I'm seeing everyone saying hello in the chat. So hi to Jessica, Janet, Harry, Fiona, Sean, Kieran, Jaya Prakesh. Delighted to welcome you all to our webinar today. This is we've done several webinars on all sorts of aspects of the postgraduate experience at Queen's, and delighted to be hosting another one today on designing for research impact. My name's Margaret Topping, and I am Associate Pro Vice Chancellor for Graduate Studies at Queen's, and also Dean of our graduate school. And I'm getting to speak to you today about an area that I feel very passionate about, but which is also absolutely core to all of our work now as researchers, and that is research impact. That is the way in which our research actively has an impact on those outside the university sector. So we've got the chat open, and so as I go through, please do just jump in and ask any questions, make any comments. Just as we start off, it would be great to get a sense of what your subject areas are, because I can mention some of that in the context of designing for research impact. So if you want to, just over the next few minutes in the chat, tell me where you're joining us from, which country, and also what your subject area is. I'm assuming that many of you are about to embark on a PhD, and maybe just let us know that, your name, PhD, and your subject area, and then we'll make sure that we talk a little bit about all of those as we go through. So let's just jump in now and keep sending the information through on the chat, and also any questions or comments. So our starting point, impact, we talk about this a lot, and I think that there is a little bit of a misunderstanding sometimes about what impact actually is. And it's something that your potential supervisors will have spoken to you about. It's something you'll have been encouraged to incorporate into your research proposals, but it is still something that's a little bit kind of complicated, and in some ways a little bit new for us in the sector. So we are, one thing we can start by saying is it's not physical impact in the sense of that we have here in this cartoon. It is something actually much more sustainable, something much more tangible, something that really does change people's lives in more positive ways. By the way, you'll notice as we go through the slideshow that some of the slides have a little ant in the corner of them. Just to explain why that is, Queen's has recently developed what we call an engaged researcher plan. And one of the images that we are using to market that plan is the idea of an ant. And I think it's really useful for impact because it does suggest how what we need to do is to work collectively together for a common good. And that's working collectively as researchers, but also with our community partners, with industry partners, with policy partners. So it's that sort of bigger picture that comes from the sort of collaborative approach. So we've got lots of people telling us what they're coming in from: arts management, psychological sciences, MA conflict transformation and social justice. Okay, great. We will pick up on some of the possible impacts that are coming through in those areas throughout today's presentation. And we'll move on to the next slide first of all. Okay, so some of you may have attended some of our earlier webinars. There's one that we did a little while ago, which was on powering your research, your PhD proposal. Now I see that a number of you are focused on coming in and doing master's programs. This is equally relevant for you here, because for your master's, you also have to do a dissertation. That should also help you start to think about impact. So just a quick reminder of some of what we said on the powering your PhD proposal. We talked about, ultimately, there are lots of terminologies used around methodology, impact and significance, all of that. But ultimately, any piece of research that you do, whether that's your master's dissertation or your PhD, or further down the line, a big research project, ultimately, what you have to start with is what, why, and how. So what are the questions you're going to seek to answer in your research? Why? I mean, who cares? Who will think differently? What will be different as a result? And then how is simply how you're going to do it. So when it comes to impact, our focus is really very much on that second question, on the why, the impact and the significance. So let's just jump in a little bit and understand further what that is all about. When I did the webinar for you on powering your PhD proposal, I showed a template that we use, and I would use this with any groups of students who are starting to think about their own research proposals. And I would ask them to fill in a kind of a template that includes, basically covers that what, why, and how, with a series of sub-questions underneath each of those, just to help guide your thinking. So these are the questions that we use when we're thinking about the why, the impact and the significance. And often I think it's important to start with the why do you want to work in this area? I suspect, given the range of subject areas that are coming through in the chat, international relations, politics, arts management, and so on, that you are people who have gone into these areas because you have a real interest and a real passion for them. And I think that is a great starting point, because as researchers, ultimately what we want to do is to make something better, whether that is for people in the creative and cultural sector, whether it's for communities, whether it's for at a national level in terms of conflict resolution. It's always about making something better, and that's our driver for doing it, and it's kind of what helps us keep our enthusiasm and our passion. So I think it's always great to start is why do you want to work in this area? What would you like to be different as a result? And then typically with that impact, you're thinking about two types of impact. You're thinking about, what am I going to contribute in terms of current academic thinking in this field, but also what am I going to contribute outside the university environment? So you want to be clear on the fact that your research is going to say something different to existing scholarship in the field, but also that it has relevance outside. And that's sometimes the biggest challenge for us, and that's probably been the biggest single shift in how we think of research in the United Kingdom in the past 10 years, the shift to a really, really strong focus on impact. And for any of those of you who are thinking about academic careers down the line, impact front and centre, that's one of the key things that really will make you stand out when it comes to jobs and getting grants and all of those kind of core attributes of a research career. So again, taking it back away from some of those questions around pathways to impact, significance, who will benefit, all that, let's just get down to the basics. And these are the questions that we want you to be thinking about as a starting point for designing for impact. Who is going to think differently because of your research? Is it going to be academics in your field? Is it going to be academics in other fields? Is it going to be people outside the university? If you think there is potential for those outside the university to think differently, how are you going to get across that across to them? How are you going to communicate it? How will you know that you have succeeded in making them think differently? Those are all the questions that we have in mind. So who will think differently? How will they think differently? What will change as a result, or what at least has the potential to change as a result? And who would potentially benefit? So get right back to the basics of who are you trying to speak to here? And what are you trying to convince them of? And from there, you start to build what we call pathways to impact, which are the ways in which you can build a research project that hopefully enables you to have the impact that you would like to have. Right. So a little bit more on what impact is and why should we care. This is our kind of formal definition of what impact is. So if you go onto any of the major funding websites, any kind of university websites, this is what they will tell you is the definition of impact: the demonstrable contribution that excellent research makes to society and the economy. And I think the key point to make there is around, it needs to be a demonstrable contribution. So in other words, when you're designing for impact, you have to be able to design a way of measuring it as well. So we'll come back to that as well, how impact is measured and the sorts of things that you could build into your project that would help you measure whether that impact has been had or not. We'll come back to that one. So lots of different forms that this contribution can take. It can be new knowledge and innovation in an academic context. You can be helping people in your discipline think differently. It could be new product development. We've got someone just joining us who's going on to the MSc in data analytics. Again, you could be coming up with new algorithms, new ways of thinking about how we use data. So that's a product element. Could be around creation of jobs, companies. It could be improving public services. It could be influencing policy. It could be about enhancing quality of life and health, and so much more. Just a few points there on, why should we care? I probably already covered this, but just to reiterate, this is really a core part of what is expected of us all now in a research environment. And that has been a big culture shift for lots of colleagues in academic environments in the UK. Personally, I think it's a brilliant thing because it's a privilege to do research. We're funded to do our research. I think it's only right and proper that we can demonstrate how that's having a positive impact on the world around us. And also, as I said before, you do research, you do a master's, you do a doctorate because you want something to be different in your professional life, in the impact that your professional role has on other people. And that sort of passion and that vision to do something differently is so often what helps you going in the dark days when you're struggling to get words on the page. So it can be, as I said before, it can be two main types of impact. It can be academic impact. That's really important. And if you think about it, one of the first things that you need to do when you're formulating your research project, whether that's your master's thesis or doctoral thesis, it's about what gap am I filling in existing scholarship in this field? What has not been studied? And how can I then help our broader understanding in the field? And in that sense, your academic impact is very much, your audience is other scholars. But the other part, and probably the more challenging part, is how do we make that contribution outside, to the people outside the university environment? And I'm just going to show you some of the ways in which that can potentially happen. So this is just a quick chart to show you the different types of impact that are possible. Everything from economic, social, public policy and services, health, cultural, environment, quality of life. I think one thing just to bear in mind, and again, particularly seeing the range of areas that you're either studying now or going on to study, sometimes I think we think about impact being kind of easier in areas like health, or perhaps in maybe technological innovation, because with health you can, if you say my research is going to provide a cure for a disease, that is, that's pretty much hard to compete with. Or it's also very clear how if someone says, well, I'm going to develop a new software program which will enable, let's think of our current context, which will enable tracking of people in the context of COVID, you can really immediately see what the impact of that is. Very, very clear, very direct. I think sometimes for those of us who are working in arts, humanities and social sciences, it can feel a little bit harder just to work out how do we demonstrate our impact. But our impact is equally important, equally valid, and in terms of all the ways that we are assessed as academics, cultural impact, quality of life impact, social impact is just as important and valued just as highly as a cure for a disease, for example. And in some ways, what I've always found interesting talking to colleagues working in, for example, in medicine, working in areas like cancer research, they actually feel as if colleagues in the arts and humanities and social sciences have more of a chance of making impact, which was surprising to me. But their argument is, my research is one part in a tiny part in a huge research journey which will go on for decades. And so in my work, the chances of my doing something that will really have impact is very, very slight. Whereas within the context of a 3-year PhD project, even within the context of a master's dissertation, you actually can engage directly with end users. If you're working in humanities, social sciences, arts management, you can get in there, you can reach your public, you can reach communities, you can have that impact very, very immediately. So try to set aside any preconceptions in your mind that impact is harder for those of us who are maybe not working in product development or in kind of health innovation. So this is probably quite a nice slide, and this slide and the next one to help you see the ways in which, again, given some of the areas that you are working in, international relations, arts management, what were the other areas? There was psychological sciences, conflict transformation and social justice, behavior analysis. So some of the ways that you can define impact there is you can be working with civil society to have an impact there. That could be doing a project, for example, around educational underattainment in particular segments of the community. It could be about working with marginalised communities to encourage them to think differently about skills and opportunities. It could be something which is redefining or helping communities to redefine their own identities. A piece of work that I'm doing at the moment is working with a community in Belfast and a community in a township in South Africa, which is actually about helping working with young people in those communities to undertake various actions which will help them to define their own identities in positive ways rather than in some of the ways that they're traditionally seen, which is maybe as quite negative, as marginalised communities, as troubled young people at risk of criminality. And they're taking control of their own identities in ways that I'm very happy to talk about. Cultural life, we do have a few from arts management here, so this is a great one. And this is one, again, where you really can have very immediate impacts. You can influence cultural practice. You can impact how audiences respond. You can engage with museums like the Ulster Museum, like the Ulster, I've forgotten the name of it, the Ulster Folk Museum, even if you're working locally, or you can be working internationally with museums, which is something that I've done as well, to help them design exhibitions, to help them understand the user experience differently. And just for anyone who is obviously coming in to do this sort of work in Belfast, the Ulster Museum is very, very open to working with colleagues in Queen's, and that includes students, on how they might do certain displays, certain exhibitions differently. One area where, and I see there's someone from Conflict Transformation and Social Justice, if you've been to the Ulster Museum, and Jessica, you're from England, so you maybe haven't been there yet, when you get here, do absolutely go to the Ulster Museum, because there's a Troubles exhibition there which deals with the legacy issues of our past in Northern Ireland. And there has been a lot of input from colleagues in Queen's, particularly in the area that you're working in, on how to do that in a way that is sensitive to all of the legacy issues around the conflict here. So really you can get involved straight away. Economic prosperity could be job creation, could be sales, technologies, products, networks. And obviously in health, it could be treatment breakthroughs, it could be heart pharmaceuticals, but it could also be interventions around improving the quality of life. Just last week, we had a 3-minute thesis competition in our graduate school, which we have every year, where our PhD students have 3 minutes, one slide, to tell us about their research. And in that, we expect them to explain the what, the why, and the how. And our winner overall was a student from nursing and midwifery, who had worked with patients who were getting dialysis and were having to be sitting linked up to a dialysis machine for 3 to 4 hours a few times a week. And she worked with them, bringing art therapy interventions in while they were sitting there and couldn't do anything else, having their treatment. And she described how previously, if they were lucky, there might be a TV in the room that they could watch, but typically people were just there going through this process. She was able to go in, pilot art interventions with them, and was able then to collect the feedback to see the impacts that it had made on them. And so that was one area where a health intervention could actually have a very immediate impact. So those are all the sorts of possibilities open to you. Other areas, of course, education, a really important one. If you can inform curriculum development and assessment. Contributions to policy. Policy change is the absolute gold standard in impact, but it is very, very difficult, because it takes a long time for policymakers to kind of reach any consensus. And that's obviously particularly fraught in our own situation where we don't have, our local government is not sitting at the moment. So policy change is probably one of those ones that takes a very, very long time. But even within the context of a master's dissertation or a PhD thesis, you could work with a school to do a pilot on a different type of curriculum intervention, a different type of assessment, collect the impacts from that and kind of use that to build into a bigger piece of research that ultimately, down the line, might change policy. So the policy making we have there, arts policy, NGOs, public discourse can be that contribution to intellectual life. And then again, public services, which can incorporate everything from the sort of health and well-being, such as the one I mentioned, the arts interventions in the dialysis treatment centre, but all the way through to how do we use public space differently. All of these are possible as early stage interventions. So very, very exciting possibilities. And I'd love to hear as we're going through the chat, if you have any ideas for what you would like to do with your study that might take it out to a public and help them think differently, do just stick those onto the chat. We'd be delighted to see them. Just including this slide because when we talk about impact, it sometimes gets confused with dissemination. So just to try to illustrate some of the differences there, I mean, dissemination is about getting out there and telling people about your research. So for example, if you were invited to, if you're working in arts management and you were invited to a local arts centre to talk about your research, which might be, I don't know, around audience participation, something like that. Giving the talk is not impact per se, because if you think back to our definition, it was about demonstrable outcomes. So we couldn't say that just going and giving a talk about your work is impact, but there are ways that you could start to develop it for impact, because you could say, well, okay, we'll do a survey of our attendees before and after, and we might be able to demonstrate that as a result of the talk or the series of talks or the workshop that you have run, that people's views on certain things have changed. That would be demonstrating impact. But just doing the talk itself is not, that's just dissemination. So for example, strictly speaking here, if you were doing a piece of work on the benefits of physical activity, simply maybe going into a school and giving the kids a talk about why physical activity is a really good thing would not be impact per se. Simply creating a learning resource on physical activity would not be enough just on its own. News coverage of your project is absolutely great, but that wouldn't allow you to demonstrate the impact. Equally, presenting at an international conference is not impact on its own, but all of these could become impact. So if you thought about, for example, you give a talk on the benefits of physical activity in a school, and maybe you develop some learning resources on physical activity that the school then puts into place. And then you suggest a program of activity over a semester. And then you come back at the beginning of the semester, the start of your project, you maybe do an assessment with all of the kids to understand what is their current level of physical activity, how many times a week, what do they do, all of those sorts of things. If you came back 12 weeks later, after you'd done your talks, they created this resource, and you could do a further survey, focus group, whatever it might be, and show actually that they had increased their physical activity levels, that is impact, because that is then demonstrable. You've got the results. So, and just to pick up Harry's question on the about having the slides available, absolutely, Harry, those will all go onto our website, as will the whole webinar itself. So no problem at all on that score. News coverage on your project, how you transform that from dissemination into impact. Certainly, it is very helpful if you can get, if you had news coverage and it was on an online newspaper, if you could get the Google Analytics statistics that showed that 10,000 people clicked onto your article, that's you're getting in the right direction, because you're already able to show something demonstrable. Presenting at an international conference, well, that's more about academic dissemination. And again, that in itself isn't enough for impact on its own. What you would need to be doing to demonstrate academic impact is to say, well, I wrote this paper, or I gave this paper at a conference, and then 20 people then quoted it or cited my work in subsequent publications. That shows your impact there. So you can see how with very simple adjustments, dissemination activity can very quickly become something that is much closer to impact because it's measurable. And certainly in the area of something like physical activity, the really big ways of demonstrating impact would be, for example, that you had taken your physical activity guidelines. Imagine the work that you've done as a pilot in a school, first of all. You've tried it out there. You've seen that there were demonstrable results, that kids became more active as a result of your work. If you then managed to get policymakers, education providers, local government to introduce that as a policy or as guidelines, that would be amazing. That is really high quality impact. Actually moving that into a stage where legislation has changed, phenomenal. Very, very hard to do in a short space of time. That's not the sort of impact you could expect to make in, say, your thesis or your master's thesis or PhD thesis. But my goodness me, in those postgraduate theses, you could be doing the first part and then thinking about, okay, in my career, I have gathered all of this evidence of impact through pilot studies. And now I am going to be working throughout my career. My next big project is to try to influence policy. Hi, Krishnan, prospective PhD candidate in agriculture from Nairobi, Kenya. Great, lovely to have you on. And I think huge possibilities for impact in the area that you're working in. And yes, just to finish this one off, then legislation would be great. But what about exercise and increase in GP exercise referrals? That would be really good evidence of a policy having an impact. As would then, leisure centres being able to report that they had a 25% increase in their memberships and so on. So can you just give me a little kind of thumbs up or yes on the chat if that distinction between dissemination and impact makes sense, and how you can see that a dissemination activity could very easily start to move into impact, and then how you can plan for much further in the future. Just as I move on to the next slide, just give me a quick yes or no in the chat as to whether that's all clear, and I can always come back further if you want me to say any more on that one. Why is it a good thing? We've already talked a little bit about, it's part of the passion of what drives us. We want things to be different. That's great. I'm seeing all the yeses coming through now. Wonderful. Thank you very much. It's about that desire to make a change. On a very practical level, it helps you develop your own network. Thanks for that. We've got an eye from Alex. Thank you for that. It allows you to develop your network. But it also gives you, I think, the new perspectives, raising awareness of why your research matters, engaging people in your research. To me, actually, the new perspectives one is probably the best one ever, and I will say a little bit more about that with some future slides. But I think it's fair to say that sometimes when we're working in an academic environment, and by definition, if you're a master's student, a PhD student, you're very bright, you have been a really high achiever, you've got a really strong scholarly background. And sometimes our starting point is, well, we're the experts, and we can go and talk to a community group or talk to a local sports club or a school and say, let us explain to you what the value of what we do, and here's how we can help you. What impact and the whole impact agenda has encouraged us to do is to say, not just to tell, not just to say, aren't we great, here we are from our university perspective, but actually to listen and to understand how much we can learn from our engagement with our end users. And I like to use that terminology of kind of end users. This is about designing with the end user in mind, not designing with the university in mind, not designing with the perspective of what we think is right or wrong in mind, but actually listening and empathizing and designing for impact from there. If any of you were on the earlier webinar that one of my colleagues did around design thinking, you'll see the sort of links that I'm making to that design thinking process. It's about not starting by what you think the solution is, but about listening to end users' needs and starting from the position of empathy and designing from there. Now, this is just, and you'll get this on the slide so you can have a look at it in more detail. But there is a National Council for Public Engagement. If you're interested in more of these sorts of ideas as you're thinking about your own research, do just do a Google search for NCCPE. It's a great website and really brings out some of these ideas very, very clearly. But this just shows you some of the motivations that people have for engaging with the public. So it is about that relevance. You know, people care, this matters to someone beyond the academic sphere. It's about raising public awareness, which is obviously great for your own profile, but also creates new stakeholders, new people to engage with your research, contributes to public debates, accountability for the use of public funds, but also that one in there quite high up, to learn from public groups. And if, you know, personally, I would put that one much higher. And that has been my experience, and of very, very challenging journeys of starting, first of all, to work with community groups and really being put in a position of, no, just wait and you listen to us. And I've learned in some ways the hard way, how you do that differently and how the results can be better. So what that all implies is that you have a very wide, potentially diverse range of stakeholders. That will be people like your supervisor. It will be, if you have someone who's funding your PhD, you may be funded by a government sponsor. They may be funding you because they want you to come and do a PhD and take the learning from that back home and have a really positive impact on policy there. We would have lots of international students in the university whose governments are funding them precisely because they want them to be part of the social and cultural change in those nations going forwards. So your funder could be a key stakeholder for you as well. But beyond that, who is it going to be? It could be industry partners, it could be schools, it could be community groups, it could be arts organisations, basically a wider public, anyone at all who has an interest in your research or who can affect or will be affected by its outcomes. And I think the other important point to make is that you should include the people who are likely to be critical or less supportive of what you're trying to do, as well as those who are supportive. Very tempting just to surround yourself by the supporters. But actually, if you really do want to have change, there will be people who are going to disagree with your approach. Any area that you're working in is going to be contentious with different views. And so best to get those people around the table as well, and try to work to a position of consensus or consensus building with them as well. So bear that in mind. You want not just your friends around the table, you want those who are going to be your critical friends, and sometimes not feel very friendly either. So this, again, you'll be able to look at this in more detail subsequently, but this is just to give you a little bit of a sense of who this might be and how you as a researcher could find yourself at the centre of a really wide range of stakeholders. And in any one project, you could actually have stakeholders in all of these areas. So who it was, I'm just remembering the name of our person who just joined us from Kenya, Krishnan. Yes, Krishnan, working in agriculture. If you put yourself here at the centre as the researcher, you might be thinking about, new technologies to improve agricultural efficiency. So you might be working with the business community, but you might also then want to have an impact on policy changes so that people will think differently about agricultural production, about food security, food safety. If that's the case, you maybe want to engage with policymakers. But if you're going to have any impact on policy, you would also have to be engaging with your public and helping them to understand why maybe you're proposing different approaches to food security, food production, food growth. So you can see how you could have multiple stakeholders just for one project, and just then think about how all of those stakeholders have all got quite different vested interests. You have your vested interests as a researcher. Sometimes that's just the immediate point of, I have to do my master's thesis, I have to do my PhD thesis, I need to get this done so that I will get my degree. but you've also started from a position of kind of passion and a position of wanting to change. Your business community obviously are wanting to look at economic impacts for them. Your policy community will probably have a very wide range of vested interests about what they believe the direction of travel should be. Certainly, for those of you looking at conflict transformation and social justice in Northern Ireland, anyone who's working in a policy context knows that there are different arguments that you make to one political party and different arguments that you make to another. So you have to understand all of that and be able to adapt your own discourse to them. You do that with integrity, but it is about, again, empathy, understanding where they're coming from, what their needs are, and how you can meet them. And one thing I would say to all of you, if you're thinking about designing your research for impact, is to try to clarify all of this at a very early stage with your stakeholders, to have a very honest conversation where you're saying to them, what do you want to get out of this? Because otherwise it can be very, very tricky to sort that out down the line. So real clarity with them about understanding what they would like to get out of it, but also realism around so that they understand what you can achieve, what you can't achieve, and so on. Okay. And that's just who is your public. This is just the point really that I was making. Particular characteristics, particular needs, particular interests. You have to really kind of understand all of your group's needs and their limitations as well. So that idea of thinking into their shoes, and this is where I would really highlight again the design thinking model. If any of you didn't get to see the webinar that my colleague Claire Harris did on that, I think it will be on our website. Donna can maybe confirm that, but it will be on our website as a recording. And if you're interested in going back and thinking about a really clear toolkit, strategies for starting from the position of empathizing and putting yourself in the position of the end user, that would be a great place to start. And through that, the importance of kind of co-creation. So often, I do a lot of work with local communities in Belfast and also local communities in kind of marginalised communities in other parts of the globe. It's very easy to go in and speak to a community organisation and say, well, we're thinking we'll do this project. We just need your group of kids in this way. This is what we're going to do. And I think this would be the outcomes of it. That immediately, as you can imagine, turns off the partner. Because the partner then can very quickly feel as if they are an object of study for you, that they are simply a research object for you. And that you don't see them as having, I guess, agency, the possibility of acting themselves, that actually you don't even see them as having the skills to be able to make change themselves. I think it's really important to see assets, to take an assets-based approach to your partners. And I do think this is particularly important when you're dealing with communities, and particularly communities which are maybe put in a kind of category of marginalised or disadvantaged. The assets in those communities is phenomenal. They may not have the research skills, the research tools to build on those assets in order to make effective change with policy, with other influencers. But my goodness me, they have an awful lot to teach us in universities. So that would be my big caveat. There have been a lot of negative projects which have ended up turning out very negatively, not so much in Queen's, but globally this has happened, where you have communities who will simply not engage with researchers from universities anymore because they've been very badly burnt by a very poor attitude in the past, where they felt as if they were just there for the purposes of the researcher to do their piece of research, get that published, and off they went. So that's why that co-creation is so important. And the other word I should have put on the slide is about sustainable relationships. So if you decide that you're going to work again with community groups, this isn't so much of an issue if you're working with big corporate companies. They're much more, I suppose, utilitarian in their approach. But with communities, if you start to get involved, imagine yourself thinking about, okay, I'm going to be involved now for the foreseeable future. Or if I'm here in Belfast for just 1 year to do my master's, and I'm not going to be able to kind of carry on working with this community, then you need to think about how there might be other people in your master's community who are going to be in Belfast who you could encourage to get involved with you. I think sustainable relationships is really absolutely core here. And the last few slides that I have, because I wanted to give some time for questions or discussion if you have any, these are just some examples of the types of impacts that researchers in Queen's have worked on in recent years. Some of you will be already very aware of this, but about every 6 years in the United Kingdom, we undergo something called the Research Excellence Framework, which is a national evaluation of our research, and every university contributes to that. And they contribute, our publications are assessed, our papers, our books, our articles, but actually now impact is one of the single biggest elements on which we are assessed. In fact, a really good impact case study, as they're described, is probably worth more than several books from some very eminent professors in terms of the return on into the university from the workings of those assessments. So it has become an incredibly important part of what we do. So this was a nice one, which is very far from my own field, as I'm a humanities scholar. But this was a piece of work that was done recently, and this was an impact case study in our last Research Excellence Framework assessment. And this is working with people who have a stoma. So as it says here, the artificial opening in the bowel that's used people to, the bag that they have when people have had a kind of bowel surgery and so on. And this is a bag that obviously has to be changed, has to be emptied on a regular basis. But what was identified was that, again, thinking about the end users were saying one of the real problems with the current technology was that the bags weren't necessarily very secure. And so they could leak all of the things that were really uncomfortable and embarrassing. So what colleagues in Queen's did was to develop a new specialist adhesive, and that was in the School of Pharmacy, that really worked to address specifically that problem and to create so much more kind of certainty and security for people with the stoma. And that now obviously has had a massive impact on the quality of life of those people who do have a stoma. But as you can see at the bottom of the slide, it's also had a massive economic impact, because a big pharmaceutical company, Eakin Pharmaceutics, took that on, and then they have, obviously benefited very significantly from the sales of that. So it's a very nice example of how you also, if you think about that stakeholder map, how you at the centre of that would have users, sort of the public, people who are in this position, who have a stoma. You would have probably healthcare professionals, but you would also have, for example, a pharmaceutical company that would have interests also in maybe taking your research idea and developing it into an economic proposition. Another one here, which is again in the medical field, but the next one I'm going to come to is perhaps more aligned to some of the areas represented on with the participants here, but PET sensors, which is about creating again a much more portable kind of PET sensor for various sorts of medical conditions. Again, you can see that this was taken on by a big healthcare technology provider, and it has been incredibly successful as a commercial product. But it has also been, in terms of kind of quality of life and life-saving impacts, it is being used every day in the critical care units, in ambulances, in GPs, in veterinary care as well, often in life and death circumstances. So again, you can see the range of impacts for end users in very immediate challenging situations of life and death, but also huge economic impact as well. And those economic impacts, they flow back into the university. They allow more research to be funded. So however we might feel about maybe big pharmaceutical companies, it's also the case that allows the research the money to come back in, and for more work to be done that again impacts positively on people. This would be a nice one actually, I think, for those of you who are, there's the conflict transformation, but I also think those in, things like arts management. So, uses of public spaces and whether we're allowed to congregate in public spaces. And it's very important, obviously, in the context of protest. It's been very, very relevant across the world in these last few weeks with protests, particularly around Black Lives Matter. But it would also be very relevant in the case of using public space for arts interventions. And again, this was a piece of work which was done and did have the impact on legal frameworks around the right to assemble for lawful protest. And it was linked into human rights scholarship. And you can see how then it has produced guidelines which have been adopted as soft law standards across many countries in the world. And, the wide range of beneficiaries that you can see at the bottom, everything from governments to NGOs and lobby groups like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and so on. So I think these three give quite a nice example, a range of examples from the sort of the medical through to the kind of social and cultural. Just given we have a number of arts management colleagues on a piece of work that I was doing recently was on urban cultural festivals. And we were able to do a piece of work with an urban cultural festival that had been started in Belfast 30 years ago. And from that, a lot of work was done, but one of the key areas that came out of that was a whole set of data that the festival was able to use in order to demonstrate the positive impacts that it had had over the 30-year period, which then influenced funders. And they have got data now that they can use every year as they go to funders. And another one has been on where we're still working through on policy guidelines, particularly around financial support for the arts sector, particularly in that kind of urban cultural festival area. So huge range of possibilities. Okay, so basically, I think this is my last slide. My big tips are thinking about the stakeholders, designing with them, not kind of for them or not on their behalf. Think about how they might be affected, whether positively or negatively. And again, that's about understanding all the different needs and perspectives of your different stakeholders. You don't want to have a positive impact for some, which has a negative impact for others. Thinking about how you'll reach them. And so much of that is about the relationship building, particularly, I think, when you're working with NGOs, communities, anyone outside the private sector, to be honest. It's about actually developing a relationship of trust. What are your key messages? And I think there's something about understanding your key messages so that you can then articulate those to your various stakeholders. You can encourage them to do the same thing. And actually you can then realize at an early stage, is there sufficient overlap here in terms of our key messages and key ideas and key ambitions? Because if you haven't got that worked out at the start, it will come up as a problem later on. And then the last one, again, I just to talk about that co-design. How do you have them co-design the project with you? We can design all the interventions in the world, but if you then go out to a community and they say, well, our kids wouldn't do that, you're stuck. So to get them involved from the outset and involve them in the research. One of the pieces of work that we are doing at the moment is trying to develop a network of community researchers. So we have young people in the community, sort of in the 18 to 25-year-old spectrum, who instead of becoming the subjects of research, we're training them up in research methods so that they can almost be the people in the community who are working alongside Queen's students, Queen's researchers, to do the interviewing, to do the focus groups. So actually that's also about kind of the future capacity building. So yes, that was my last slide. So I am, it was great to talk to you all today. I think we probably have, Donna, probably a little bit of time for any comments or any questions or any ideas you have. Do please jump on, but I hope you got something out of the session today, and we'll certainly make that all available to you afterwards. Thank you, Faye. It's been a pleasure. This is one I very much enjoy talking about and really want people to start thinking about. In the UK context, when impact became a big part of our research excellence framework about 10 years ago, a lot of colleagues felt this is a real pain. Why do we have to do this? And they've had to, play catch up. Lots and lots of people who had never really thought about impact suddenly we're working out how do we catch up. In my job as Dean of the Graduate School, I think it's great if people like yourselves who are starting on your research journey, from the very start, you think about designing for impact, designing about for the end product. So great. Thank you for the comments on the chat. I'm glad this was really useful. And if you at any point want to touch base with me, you can obviously find me very easily on the Queen's website, and happy to give you any more advice on how you might move forward with your research. So great, everyone. I'll stay on just for a few more minutes in case there is any other observations or comments. But thanks all again. Bye.